Mass extinctions, parasitism, predation, disease. Why is nature so cruel? Philosophers and theologians have wrestled with this question for centuries, trying to come up with some explanation of how an all-good and all-powerful God could allow so much seemingly pointless suffering in the natural world. But many of those explanations, frankly, fall short. In today's interview, I'm joined by Dr. Brian Cutter and Dr. Philip Swenson, two philosophers who propose a new and provocative answer to the problem of natural evil. It's called the Omission Theodicy. In this conversation, they'll explore the idea that God might have allowed the natural world to be governed by fallen angels, but these beings failed to steward it well, and that, they argue, explains the natural evil that we see. They'll also respond to some of the strongest objections this theodicy faces. If you've ever struggled to understand how a good God could allow so much suffering in nature, this is the conversation for you. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian. Let's get started. What is a subsumption theodicy, and what are some specific examples?
Yeah, so a subsumption theodicy, and I'll say we take this term from a paper from Dustin Crummett. So the basic idea is a theodicy that tries to subsume apparent cases of natural evil under the category of moral evil, claiming that apparent cases of natural evil are somehow result from the misuse of creaturely free will. So just to give some examples, one classic example would be like fall theodicies, where somehow nature is corrupted by the sins of the first humans, and that's why we have cases of apparent natural evil. Maybe Philip can mention some other examples.
Yeah, so another example is is a demonic action theodicy. So maybe demons or the devil or some kind of evil being is causing natural disasters or causing evils that are outside of human control. And then a third example, which is more recent, I think, and maybe a little even wilder, is simulation theodicies, which this relies on the idea that maybe we're living in a computer simulation, right? So some people have thought, look, if we get advanced enough to create computer simulations, we probably would. And if beings in computer simulations are conscious, then there might end up being a whole lot of them, right? More people might be living in computer simulations than not. And then maybe the odds are we're one of those groups of people living in a computer simulation. And they've said, and the thought then is, look, if we're living in a computer simulation, then the natural evils that happen in our world are actually due to the whoever programmed the simulation. So maybe God isn't directly responsible for the evils that happen in our simulation. Rather, it's the computer programmers or the simulation creators who are responsible.
Before I move to the next question, I had come up with this theodicy like a few months ago after listening, I guess, to several interviews with Philip Goff, and then reading your paper. I was like, oh, I wonder if that's a subsumption theodicy. Tell me if this would qualify. Listening to Philip Goff, I was like, oh, if I took panpsychism, like this cosmic panpsychism, seriously, then it would be like the cosmic agent is responsible for all this stuff. Like it was the fall of that agent that results in all this chaos in the universe. And maybe that agent allows God to do some things on this little speck of it somewhere, but for the most part, God's out of the picture and the agent's like, I'm doing this by myself. I don't know. I just was wondering, would that be a subsumption theodicy? Even if it's like, that's a terrible theodicy, it might qualify.
So the thought is God creates the physical cosmos, but the cosmos kind of has a mind of its own.
Yeah.
And free will, and misuses that free will, and that's why that would count as a subsumption theodicy.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, that gives people a sense of the move, absorbing what would typically be natural evil into some kind of moral evil. Okay, now, there are specific versions. You just gave some. We didn't mention any problems with these yet. So what are some problems that you find with specific versions that are currently on offer?
Good. So maybe we'll start with the fall theodicies. So the biggest problem is it just doesn't touch pre-human animal suffering. So, this, if you think that the Earth has been around for hundreds of millions of years, before human beings on the scene, with sentient animals around for much of that time. Then, there was a lot of pain and death and suffering among those animals. It's hard to explain that in terms of the sins of the first humans, at least not without backwards causation or some kind of extravagant metaphysics that we'd like to avoid. So that would be the main problem with kind of human fall based theodicies. Demonic action theodicies, the biggest issue is they tend to posit causes for natural evils that are in competition with naturalistic scientific explanations. So this is pretty clear in cases where, you want to say that a demon is responsible for earthquakes or forest fires or avalanches. Like, we just have pretty good naturalistic explanations for those things. It looks like the demonic action hypothesis is in competition with those scientific explanations and competes unfavorably. I think it also holds for views that put the demonic action a little bit further back. So Alvin Plantinga, C.S. Lewis suggests that maybe, fallen angels steered evolution in bad directions, leading to pain and predation and waste and Malthusian scarcity and all the rest. The problem there is essentially the same. I mean, we have good naturalistic explanations for why a Darwinian evolutionary process would often lead to Malthusian scarcity, for example, and the associated suffering. And so we just, don't need demonic action to explain that sort of thing.
Turning to the simulation hypothesis, or the simulation theodicy, the main worry there is that it threatens skepticism. So if you think we're living in a simulation, the question is, how big is that simulation? Is it, are the simulators really simulating the whole universe and all of the history we think we know about, right? Did Abraham Lincoln actually exist? Was he actually part of the simulation? Or could they be just simulating the room I'm in right now? We think it's just not so clear that most of the simulations would be like really big simulations. So we think the simulation hypothesis would raise the worry that, maybe, there's a good chance that the world is very different than I think it is. Lots of things that I think are real and really out there might not be, because they're not really part of the simulation. So that's the main worry we have there.
Well, I guess that might bring up an objection. What's the problem there? It just turns out that what's fundamental is just it's a very different sort of thing than we initially thought, but it's still there. Just has a different nature than we thought. Like, would that get you out of this one?
Yeah, so we actually don't push that worry. We don't push the worry like, oh, this is skeptical hypothesis because it turns out that things are fundamentally different than we thought. Rather, we're worried about, like, even if we grant that just in virtue of being in a simulation, that doesn't follow that you're in a skeptical scenario. We still think, but how do you know the simulation is as big as we think the universe is, right? So you believe lots of things, like you believe you have friends in a few houses down or a few towns over. And even if, Chalmers is right about there not being a skeptical problem just in virtue of us being digital or something, there's still a problem if, like, your friend doesn't really exist because he's not really part of the simulation. So that's what we're more worried about.
Okay.
Yeah, so grant that a simulated X is a real X for relevant values of X. So a simulated chair would count as a real chair, as Chalmers would argue. The issue here is maybe fewer things are actually simulated than we think exist in reality. So if the distant past wasn't part of the simulation, maybe they tried to save computing power by not including that in the simulation. Well, then it would turn out that Abraham Lincoln never existed, or the Cambrian explosion never happened, or what have you. Maybe, galaxies outside our own aren't actually simulated. They just simulate, like, the twinkle in the sky in order to save on compute. Well, then there aren't actually galaxies outside of ours. And so you get skepticism about all the things that aren't actually simulated, which could be a large fraction of the things that we actually.
Okay. Before I move on, one more thing on that. You might think this would actually help what the project is, because maybe there's a lot less evil than we initially thought. Even what appears maybe gratuitous, it's like, well, that stuff isn't really happening. I don't know.
Possibly. I mean, the worries here are just like, if you're proposing a hypothesis that goes wildly against everything that we think we know from science and his ordinary experience, then there's some prima facie reason to reject it. I mean, a similar point goes for just like the young Earth creationist fall theodicies, where, okay, well, maybe the Earth is not very old, in which case all the hundreds of millions of years of suffering that standard science believes happened didn't really happen. Well, in a way, that makes the problem of evil less hard, because there's all this animal suffering that you don't need to account for, but you're kind of flying in the face of what seems to be strong scientific evidence.
Okay, now you offer a version of a subsumption theodicy that you think avoids these kinds of problems, and you call this an omission theodicy. What is the core idea of the omission theodicy?
Yeah, good. So the core idea of the omission theodicy is that apparent cases of natural evil can be traced to the omissions of free agents who had the power to prevent them, but culpably failed to do so. So on one version, maybe God appointed a group of angels as guardians and protectors of the earth and gave them the task of preventing natural evils and maybe steering the course of evolution in positive directions, away from its default tendencies towards pain and predation and waste and scarcity. But they freely abdicated their divinely appointed role. And that's why we live in the kind of messy, crappy situation that we find ourselves in. So that would be one version. But the general idea of any omission theodicy is that we're going to explain apparent cases of natural evil in terms of the omissions of free creatures. The analogy we use is something like, natural evils are akin to harms that befall the children of negligent parents, or harms that befall the citizens of, negligent governments. A lot of people might suffer due to the culpable failure of governments to provide protection and vaccines and good infrastructure. As opposed to, being like actively targeted by government agents.
What about alien isolationism? That's another version.
So this is another example we give of how this could go. This might be less appealing to most of your listeners, but maybe there are some people who are skeptical of angels but find aliens plausible. So this is another scenario we give. So imagine long before life evolved on Earth, it evolved on a somewhat nearby planet, but they evolved in a way where they didn't feel pain. Maybe they were motivated in other ways. Maybe they just had like varying degrees of pleasure, so they didn't have the kind of like natural evil that we have on Earth. Another way they could have evolved is they could have maybe like what would be a painful reaction for us is like a reflex for them. So like when they touch the burning fire, they just have a natural reflex to move away, but it doesn't come with like a painful felt state or anything intrinsically bad like that. So suppose that happens. And then when they get very advanced, they discover pain in the lab. They're fiddling with brains and they go, oh my gosh, there's this intrinsically bad state that things can experience. And their scientists wonder, could that have evolved? Could that have been like part of the way beings were motivated naturally? And they go, oh yeah, they could have. And so they're, some of them, kind of, there's like a do-gooder faction who says, look, we should go throughout the galaxy and try to steer evolution on other planets away from pain, right? But then they have sort of an isolationist wing. Goes, oh, let's just stay close to home. Let's not worry about other planets. We shouldn't be interfering anyway. And so they decide not to interfere. And then because of that, we end up with pain evolving on Earth. And, they could have prevented it. They knew they could have prevented things like that from happening, and they culpably chose not to do it.
Okay, so that's the Archon abandonment and the alien isolationism version of the omission theodicy. Since Archon abandonment is a very prominent label that you use in the paper, you might want to mention what Archon even means.
Yeah, so, we got the label Archon abandonment, Matthew Adelstein, who suggested that, but the term Archon we borrowed from Mark Johnston, a recent paper that he wrote on the problem of evil. So Archon, I believe, is the the Greek term used in the New Testament by St. Paul when he's talking about, we fight not against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities. I believe one of the words for powers or principalities is archon. But basically the thought is kind of the original created spirits, something like, angels. The one hang up people have about the term angel is that the term angel kind of refers to the beings in terms of their role as messengers etymologically, whereas the role here doesn't really have anything to do with being a messenger. But the kinds of beings, the kind of like created, very powerful, intelligent spirits that have traditionally been called angels, that's the kind of being we have in mind.
Yeah. Okay, so I didn't mean to distract, but hopefully that tells people where the term archon's even coming from. But the two versions of the Omission Theodicy are the archon abandonment version and then the alien isolationism version. And you could cook up other versions of the Omission Theodicy. The key is it's the omission of intervention, it seems. Like you're intervening in certain ways to avoid what would be natural evil. And if you don't perform those actions, then that omission ends up resulting in all this natural evil that we get. Okay, now let's talk about some objections to the Omission Theodicy. The first one would be this: God should just cut out the middleman here and do things himself, rather than when you thought of or when you gave the parent analogy, like the bad things that happen to the children as a result of a negligent parent, it reminded me it seems like God hired a negligent babysitter, and it's like, this is just a bad idea to hire a negligent babysitter. Just take them out, just do this job yourself, or get a better babysitter. Okay, what do you think?
Yeah, so the first thing to notice here is that this same question comes up for free will responses to evil in general, even to moral evil, right? So, if God allows a real parent to neglect their child, well, why doesn't he cut out the middleman and just take care of that child, right? And I think the main thing that free will theodicies need to say is, look, there's some important good in leaving some things up to us, right? A version I really like is that there's a great good in allowing us to make a difference in each other's lives, to actually have an impact on how well or poorly each other's lives go. Similarly, you could say about the archons or the aliens, like there's a good in allowing them to be able to make a difference. So that's why God shouldn't just do everything himself. He should leave some things up to us so we can achieve that good. Whatever different free will theodicies will appeal to different goods, but one would be just the good of being responsible for making a difference in each other's lives. Now, something I've said, which I don't think I can pin on, and Brian is endorsing this too, but something I've argued in a different paper is that God is not, because God is so morally lucky, like God's essentially perfect, he can't evil at all. He doesn't get moral credit for his actions in the way that we can. So if God wants the good of people getting moral credit for making a difference in each other's lives, well, then he can't do it himself because he can't get that kind of moral credit. So if he wants that particular good to be achieved, he has to pass the buck to us in order to get that kind of good of moral credit into the world.
And you've gone into more detail on that in one of the videos that we did. I remember we talked about this more. I think maybe, I can't remember the exact title, but I'll make sure I put it in the description. But I remember discussing this with you. Okay.
But Brian, Brian, you may not agree with that second.
Well, yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't put it in the same way. I mean, I do like, so St. Anselm has a line that since God is kind of ase, God is from himself, every good thing that he does, even though he's incapable of sinning, he still gets credit for the good things he does because they're ultimately from him. But when it comes to creatures, there needs to be a kind of leeway freedom, the freedom to either do good or evil, in order for anyone for any creature to have to be like praiseworthy or creditworthy for the good. Because if God just creates a creature with a nature that deterministically leads to a good outcome, then that creature is not the ultimate source of that action, because God is the ultimate source. And so in order for any creature to be the kind of ultimate source of their good actions, God's got to give them some leeway, freedom between good and evil. So, but on either account, I think you can say that God gives this morally significant freedom to either do good or refrain from doing good, or to do good or to do evil, in order to make it possible for creatures to be praiseworthy or creditworthy for the good they do. That, I think, is at least one reason why God would give us this kind of freedom.
Okay, so those responses essentially try to say, hey, there's a good reason, there's some good achieved here when God doesn't cut out the middleman. And people are going to fill in the details on what that good is in different ways, but the idea is there's a good achieved here. So then this leads to the second objection, which is even if some great good is achieved, it's just not worth the horrible cost that's paid. So how would you respond to that objection?
Yeah, good. So we give 3 or 4 responses to that in the paper. But one thing to note initially, again, is like this is a problem for free will theodicies in general. So we're not trying to solve. Our main goal isn't to solve every problem for free will theodicies. We're trying to say, hey, look, if free will theodicies work, they can be applied to what we thought was natural evil too. But because we do think free will theodicies are good, so we do say something. So one thing. One idea we float is the possibility that let's take the angels. Suppose the angels had done their job and made a positive difference in your life, and now suppose you go to heaven and you have a relationship with that angel. It might be that at every time in the future, or at least at infinitely many times in the future, your relationship with that angel is at least a little bit more valuable because he made this difference in your life. And if at infinitely many times your relationship is even a tiny bit more valuable, then on some views that would add up to infinite value, or over time, or on other views maybe just a really, really high finite value. And then either way, maybe that is enough. You do get either infinite value or at least enough value to outweigh even really horrible evils. So that's one thing we say. Another thing we say is that maybe it's really good for creatures to be cared for by higher beings with great value and great status, even if they're not fully aware of it. So think of a squirrel or something. Suppose there's an angel looking out for that squirrel, making sure that squirrel is okay. Maybe there's great value in being cared for by a really important being. Think about how valuable it is that if theists are right that God loves us. It's really cool that God is there looking out for us. Similarly, it might be really cool that there's an angel or an archon or something out there looking out for us or looking out for the squirrel. Maybe that adds a great value. And then the third thing we say is that maybe there's great value for the angels. Like maybe it's good for them suppose they had chosen to do their job and prevent natural evils. Maybe there would have been a great good for them in making a difference in the lives of creatures on Earth. Or maybe there's great value in being like a creator with God of a good world, right? So like getting to play a role in creating this beautiful world with God. Maybe there's great value for the angels in that. So those are some of the things we say.
I didn't mention this objection in the outline. Here's the additional worry. There might be a sufferer-centered requirement on this. So you might think, okay, it's good that God has the angels have this, or archons have this sort of responsibility for us. That's good for them, say, but it's not good for us. So and I know you could say, oh, but that first thing I said about, well, maybe my relationship with the angels at every point in the future, that would be good for me and for the angel or archon. Okay. Well, then what about the animals? How's it good for the animals that suffer? What would you do with that one?
Yeah, good. So if there is a sufferer-centered requirement, it might be, think about that second thing you said. Maybe it's like good for the squirrel to be cared for by a great being, right? So maybe there's value for you in having a certain kind of relationship of being cared for by a wonderful being, even if you don't appreciate it or can't even understand it. I don't know, think about like a baby being cared for by its parents versus a baby being cared for by like a mindless robot or something. Maybe there's value for that baby in being cared for by its parents, even if it can't appreciate or understand it. Um, so that's one thing we could say.
Mhm.
But the other thing is you could reject a sufferer-centered requirement. We don't want to commit either way on sufferer-centered requirements. So that'd be another possibility.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is worth noting how strong the relevant sufferer-centered requirements would need to be to make trouble for our theodicy. So, like we ordinarily think in the human domain, there are certainly possible cases where I'm allowed to cause one person to suffer a little bit in order to make possible a vastly greater good for someone else. There's no general moral requirement in the human realm that like if you're ever going to let someone suffer for the sake of some greater good, then like that greater good needs to belong to that person who suffered. Like no, sometimes you can like shove someone out of the way, causing them a slight tinge of pain in order to save someone's life. That's not wrong. That's perfectly fine. Of course, I mean, we're talking about suffering on a much greater scale here, but the general principle that you can never cause or allow someone to suffer in order to make possible a good exclusively for someone else, like that's just not a very that principle doesn't seem plausible when it comes to our own moral obligations, and so it's not clear why things would be different for God. Another possibility we consider in the paper is maybe we should accept sufferer-centered requirements when it comes to persons, but not for animals. And so maybe if you don't want to allow for like animal afterlife, but you do want to allow for persons to have an afterlife, then you can talk about the potential value for persons in the afterlife with this increased improved relationship with the archons, but not go in for sufferer-centered requirements for animals.
Interestingly, I was talking with my students this semester about a related issue. So, the standard push the man off the bridge to save five trolley example. So most of them, of course, have the intuition, don't push him off the bridge. So I gave them a case. What if you had to push one cow off a bridge to save five other cows? And there, most of their intuition flips, right? Where they say, oh yeah, it would be okay to push one cow off the bridge to save five cows. So that might be some evidence that there is a non-human animal difference here, where maybe there are more constraints on harming humans to benefit others than there are in harming non-human animals to benefit others.
Okay. So we've looked at basically two objections so far. I want to move to the third. And this one kind of takes things away from just picking on free will theodicies in general. This one says, this omission theodicy is just very implausible because it involves all these speculative commitments that go way beyond theism. You have to believe in these kinds of powers and principalities, or you got to believe in like aliens, which maybe people would be like, well, that's not so implausible, but you got to believe this really implausible story about the aliens, not wanting to help us and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so we don't really think it's an ad hoc or awkward addition to bare theism. I mean, it certainly does go logically beyond the commitments of bare theism. It goes logically beyond the commitments of any major theistic religion. But every major theistic religion traditionally believes in powerful, highly intelligent, created spirits, some of whom have responsibilities over terrestrial affairs. So, all we add to that is the pretty modest conjecture that some of those powerful, intelligent, created spirits specifically had the responsibility to prevent the sorts of natural evils that we find in our world. So that doesn't seem like an ad hoc add-on totally out of left field. It seems like a modest conjecture added to the consensus view of every traditional theistic religion that there are, there's the drama of creation goes well beyond the human domain. There are highly intelligent, highly powerful created spirits that are in some way bound up with earthly affairs and human affairs. So this doesn't seem to go radically beyond that. That's kind of appealing to traditional views of major theistic religions. But if you're just thinking of kind of like a more straightforward, just philosophical theism that's not wedded to any particular religious tradition, I think you could still argue that it's not very implausible, given theism, that God would create a lot of intelligent beings, maybe of, including intelligent beings, much more intelligent, much more powerful than human beings. I think it's implausible on theism that we would be kind of the top of the food chain as far as the created order is concerned. I would be utterly unsurprised, given theism, if there's just kind of like vast hierarchies, maybe infinite hierarchies of beings well beyond the human level in terms of intelligence and power. That seems like pretty plausible conditional on theism. So, given that, it's not too much of an addition to suppose that some of those beings, much more powerful and intelligent than us, specifically had responsibilities over earthly affairs.
Your response might be the same for this next objection. This next objection is related, and the thought was, at least the connection I was trying to make was, on Christianity, beings like this aren't terribly surprising. Even on theism, beings like this might not be all that surprising, like you said. But now, kind of honing in just on Christianity, because hey, this is the Analytic Christian, and I'm a Christian. Some people might think this fits really poorly with traditional Christian views on what fallen angels, what kind of control they have and what kind of things they do and so on. It looks more like, I'm thinking of like demons, demons in the New Testament, they possess both people and, there's an episode where demons go into a pig, but when they're possessed, they run pigs off a cliff. Like, that's an action. That's not like, I neglected to intervene. And same thing with causing diseases and things like that. Like, it looks like demons are meddling in things. And so people might be like, where are you getting this idea that they're over the whole system and that they're kind of standing back rather than actively causing problems?
Yeah, so it's not part of the Omission Theodicy to deny that fallen angels actively cause lots of harm. It's totally consistent with everything we say, that there are a lot of cases of active harm caused by fallen angels. The key idea is just that the broad brush facts of natural evil, like the fact that nature seems to be red in tooth and claw, that we seem to be subject to just like the whims of chance, we seem to be the playthings of chance, as Peter Van Inwagen says. The fact that nature seems to be largely indifferent to the interests of sentient creatures, those sorts of broad brush facts of natural evil are supposed to be primarily due to the fact that the beings who were supposed to guide things in better directions failed to do so. That's consistent with saying that on many particular occasions, there are active harms caused. So, an analogy we use in the paper is you might think that the fact that there is a certain naturally occurring disease that's harming lots of people and causing lots of deaths is primarily due to the fact that the government culpably failed to develop, the vaccines against it. That claim is fully compatible with the further claim that there have been many particular occasions where malicious government agents actively infected people with the virus. There's no incompatibility there. And I think actually, like, there are a lot of points in the Archon abandonment theodicy that I think cohere pretty nicely with traditional Christian views and scriptural views about Satan and other fallen angels. So, in the New Testament, Satan is described as like prince of this world, the prince of the power of the air. There are a lot of parables which kind of describe Satan as like analogous to like the owner of the house, or he's standing to earth as an owner does to the house. And so like there's this sense that like the earth is kind of under Satan's control. Satan is like the prince of this world, at least in the current age. And that fits really well with our theory, because the thought is like, look, these angelic beings were like given control and stewardship over the earth, and then they failed to do their job. But that doesn't take away their responsibility and their kind of lordship over it, it would kind of explain like why it is that Satan gets to be in this role in the first place. There's also kind of traditional Christian view. So there's the traditional Christian view is that when the first humans sinned, they thereby lost their union with God and all the protections that union entailed. But then a further thing happened. They didn't merely lose their union with God, they also fell under the dominion of the devil. Now, like, why is that? Like, it makes sense that, okay, you sin against God, you're going to lose your union with God. Why would you by default fall under the dominion of the devil just by losing your union with God? Why wouldn't you like merely be in the desert or, unattached? Well, I think, that makes sense if devil was already in control of the earth before humans came on the scene. So an analogy might be like if a child runs away from home and thereby loses the protections of their parents, they would naturally find themselves under the control of whoever already controls the surrounding territory. So I think there are a lot of features of the account that cohere pretty well with scriptural and traditional views of angels. I mean, it's also just been extremely common in the history of theology and the patristic period and the scholastic period to say that angels were given care and control over all sorts of details of the governance of creation, and can even find quotes from Aquinas saying that like the devil was among the angels who were given care of creation from the beginning. And of course, he didn't do everything he was supposed to do, but I think those traditional patristic and historical views fit very well with our account.
Okay, so people have a sense of what the Omission Theodicy is, a couple different versions of it. Particularly the Archon Abandonment version is kind of like, not that the Christian couldn't go for the alien isolationism view, but the Christian might be like, well, in the New Testament, there's some reason to think that this is the setup, so that might be a little more of a natural fit with Christianity. But people have a sense of that and how you'd handle some objections. What we haven't done is said much about the advantages that the Omission Theodicy has. Not only advantages over other Subsumption Theodicies, because people might be like, well, that's already a crappy Theodicy, so to say you're doing better than that isn't really saying much. I do want you to say what advantages the Omission Theodicy has over those other Subsumption Theodicies. But before we do that, maybe just mention what I take to be a bigger advantage, which is this looks like it can accommodate very nicely the intuition that it looks like the distribution of evils and the types of evils, and it's all just this indifferent sort of scenario. Maybe mention that first, and then we'll shift to advantages you have over other Subsumption Theodicies.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, this I think is one of the biggest pro features of the Theodicy. So, as I see it, the main piece of evidence against theism or for naturalism, it's not so much the existence of evil. It's not so much that there's a huge quantity of evil or suffering in the world. It's the distribution of evil, the fact that good evils, but also good, seem to be distributed in a way that, as Paul Draper says, seems not to be the result of the actions of any benevolent or malevolent agent. Goods and evils just kind of strike at random. It's based on like who happened to be in this location when the earthquake struck, or who happened to have the genetic mutation that made them vulnerable to the disease, or who happened to be in the intersection when the car came by. There's this kind of like random, haphazard, seemingly indifferent distribution of evil that just seems kind of like the distribution you'd expect if it weren't the result of either good agency or bad agency. So that I take it as the main bit of evidence against theism or for naturalism. And I think it's a really nice feature of our account that it just nicely predicts and explains this appearance of indifference. An analogy we use in the paper is, consider three idealized governments: the good government, the evil government, and the merely negligent government, where whose officials are just asleep at the wheel. So the good government, they've got their act together, they do everything right. the evil government, they selectively target people who are, speaking out against the state or not being obedient or whatever. So in all of these regimes, you'd expect there to be some suffering, but the distribution of suffering will differ. So under the good government, maybe suffering will primarily befall, criminals, and they'll get the suffering they deserve for their misdeeds. Under the bad government, you might expect suffering to disproportionately fall on those who are like outspoken critics of the state, who like mysteriously, have accidents occur to them at a disproportionate rate. Whereas on the negligent government, there'd be lots of suffering, but its distribution would be pretty haphazard, pretty random, pretty indifferent seeming. Like, people would die from natural disasters because the government didn't provide the infrastructure to protect against them. But exactly who dies or who suffers is going to be due to like random chance or various circumstantial factors that don't seem to have much moral significance. Or, the facts about like who dies from the disease that the government didn't make the vaccines for is going to be due to just happenstance about, what your genes are and where you happen to be when and so forth. So it's sort of have a kind of seemingly indifferent distribution. So the negligent government is most analogous to the situation we have according to the Omission Theodicy. It predicts a distribution of suffering that's kind of haphazard, kind of random seemingly indifferent. This is, I think, a pretty big advantage over a lot of other theodicies, not just other subsumption theodicies, but other theodicies, like even for moral evil, because a lot of these seem like they definitely don't straightforwardly predict an indifferent distribution, and if anything, they often seem to predict the opposite. So, if you think suffering is due to, like punishment for people's sins, nobody actually goes in for that these days. But that doesn't seem to be the distribution. It's not like suffering befalls people in proportion to how evil they are. That's just not the way the world works. But also, suppose you think that the reason God allows suffering is to give people opportunities to exercise virtues. Well, I don't know. Does suffering befall people in proportion to people's like need to grow in virtue? Or suppose you think that God allows suffering in order to convince people of the futility of pursuing happiness apart from God. Well, some people need to learn that lesson more than others. Does suffering befall people in accordance with how much they need to learn that lesson? It doesn't really seem like it. And so, a lot of these theodicies, they give you reasons why suffering might be associated with some greater good or might make possible some greater good, but they don't seem to predict anything like the actual indifferent distribution that we find in the world.
Did you have any advantages that you want to mention, Philip?
Maybe this is too obvious to mention, but I guess the scope of it, I think, is very exciting. So, many theodicies, you're like, oh, we have a good explanation for this kind of evil, but there's still these other kinds of evils we have no good explanation for. And this one, I think, has the potential. Any evil that isn't explained by human free will, it can be explained by this theodicy. Whereas if you look at like fall theodicies, as we mentioned, they have trouble explaining pre-human animal suffering. So I think, I guess another, exciting thing about this is just like how many evils it could explain.
You already mentioned, Brian, how this has some advantages over other subsumption theodicies, but let's mention maybe a few more. One of which is, it seems like there's no conflict with scientific explanations for natural evil. So you can elaborate on that, but there's not like a competing explanation.
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the main motivations for, like if you're comparing our angelic version of the Omission Theodicy to demonic action theodicies, this is just the key advantage. So the main problem with demonic action theodicies is they seem to propose explanations for natural phenomena that are in competition with the standard naturalistic scientific explanations, whereas the Omission Theodicy just can totally, fully accept the standard naturalistic scientific explanation. So you want to know why there was an earthquake? Well, talk to the geologists and they'll tell you about the plate tectonics. We can accept that story in full. We don't need to say, well, that's only part of the story, but it wouldn't have actually shifted without a little nudge from the demon. It's like, no, we can accept that the full naturalistic explanation of the earthquake. We just say, yeah, all the bad stuff and all the suffering that resulted from that, there were beings that had the power to prevent that in some way or other. Or you look at the standard explanation from evolutionary biology for why in many conditions you get conditions of scarcity and misery, or why predators evolve, and we can just accept that complete scientific story. We merely add to that there were beings on the scene who had the power and responsibility to steer things in a different direction. They failed to do so. But in terms of like the positive causal story for why there are predators, why there are diseases, why there's scarcity, we can just accept the standard scientific explanations. And we don't need to say that they're merely partial or they're leaving out a little nudge from the demon.
What advantage does the Omission Theodicy have over the simulation type of Subsumption Theodicy?
Yeah, so we already mentioned the main worry we had, which is skeptical worries. We don't think our view raises anything like the same kind of skeptical worries. Another advantage you might mention is, theists have traditionally thought of God as the creator of the world, and this simulation theodicy seems to water that down significantly. So, like, God didn't really create our universe; He created some universe with some simulators in it, and then they created our universe. Or maybe it goes multiple levels down. God created a universe, and they created another universe, and our simulators live in that one, right? So, if you like this idea, like, yeah, God is our creator and creator of our world in a kind of direct way, the simulation theory kind of takes away from that.
But on the Omission Theodicy, like the Archon Abandonment version, God creates our world and puts someone in charge of the world, these Archons in charge, but at least God is the direct creator of it.
Yeah. Now, on our view, you might think it's not plausible that every single Archon failed to do their job. So there might be like some parts of our world that are not so directly run by God, but are run by some of the Archons who are still doing their job. But we want to say at least like a significant part of the project was done directly by God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I should maybe clarify, when we're saying world, we're thinking of like the whole universe, not just like the Earth, because somebody may be like, but we know from science that God didn't create. We know exactly how the Earth was formed. So we're thinking essentially
universe.
Like, spark the Big Bang, or something along those lines. Okay, now to wrap up, I would like to ask you about the plausibility of the Omission Theodicy. So typically, the way I've heard Theodicies, these are supposed to be like the difference between a defense and a theodicy. Defense just tries to give like a possible account, but theodicy is supposed to be like a very plausible or like very probable sort of account. I don't know, am I characterizing that correctly, the difference between a defense and a theodicy? And if so, just how plausible or probable do you think the Omission Theodicy is?
Yeah, there's this famous distinction in philosophy of religion. I think it goes back to planning to find a defense as just some story that's meant to be like logic. It's meant to establish the like logical compatibility of God and evil, whereas a theodicy is something that you put forward as something like known truth. Like if you're giving a theodicy, you claim to be this know-it-all who like knows exactly why God allows evil, and you're here to tell people what's what. So, I mean, we use the term theodicy, but we don't mean it in that strong of a sense. We mean something intermediate in strength between Plantinga's notion of defense and Plantinga's notion of theodicy. So, a story that is not merely a logical possibility, but one that we think should be taken seriously. One that, it's like a serious possibility on the table. So, I mean, it would be hard to pin numbers on it. I guess I'd be willing to stand by a credence of somewhere in the like 20 to 60% range. But I don't know where Philip stands on that.
So you have I've heard this other author that I've interviewed use the term middling credence. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one, Brian. But
Yeah,
no,
I've got a middling credence in it.
maybe it's safe to say you have a middling credence in the Omission Theodicy.
Yeah, we say it should be added to the list of like leading, not too implausible hypotheses for why God might allow the natural evils we find in our.
At the end of the day, evil is still going to be some evidence against the existence of a good God. It's just a matter of mitigating the damage so theism can win on other grounds, and when we look at other evidence and other arguments. And I think, yeah, so you want it to, the more plausible it is, then the more it mitigates the damage, right? Yeah, I agree with Brian that it's, it's a middling plausibility, but I think that's enough to do. Sometimes, like, when you think about cases like Rose Fawn or something, some people just say, I just can't see any reason at all why God would allow this. So even getting something that seems plausible enough, I think, is can be major progress, and then allows you to go look at other arguments for theism and say, okay, these are pretty good, and I have something to say about evil, so theism comes out ahead.
Yeah, and especially in this dialectic, I don't know. I was here for a long time before thinking about these sorts of theodicies, where you think, okay, if you're dealing with the realm of human evil, then you can come up with some plausible stories about the value of free will and the value of exercising certain virtues that would be impossible to exercise if there were no suffering, and the goods of co-creatorship, and maybe certain kinds of relationships, like loving relationships, require some kind of morally significant freedom. And all of that sounds kind of vaguely plausible when you're in the domain of like human evil. But then you remember, oh yeah, what about the hundreds of millions of years of animals suffering before that? And none of those stories just even get off the ground. Unless you're willing to go in for, I think the way many people think about this is the only way to get a free will theodicy off the ground is to go in for some weird demonic action story, but that's going to be in competition with better scientific explanations for why there's like earthquakes and predators and things like that. And so the whole problem of like pre-human animal suffering just seemed to me for a long time to be this huge problem that I didn't really know what to say about it. And there's like regularity theodicies where like maybe the only way God could have prevented this is by a bunch, like intervening a bunch and performing tons of miracles all over the place, and maybe that would be like a defect in creation. So Peter Van Wagen has a story like this, and kind of feels like, yeah, that's a merely aesthetic defect in creation. Are we really going to weigh that against like all the millions of years of like excruciating pain of these animals? It just doesn't seem to weigh on the same scale. Whereas like here, I think we just have like a decently plausible free will style theodicy that imports the same considerations that I think like kind of you can get in the mindset where it feels like it could justify evil in the human domain, and now it just kind of you can extend it pretty naturally to the non-human domain.
I found this extremely persuasive. I thought, I'm not going to say like I'm 80% confident, but I'm comfortable being like, this is the best subsumption theodicy that I've seen in my opinion. And for a long time I remember several years ago I was reading Greg Boyd's book, Satan and the Problem of Evil, I think was the name of it. And I was finding a lot of things in there, like at least the scriptural kind of case, the sort of stuff you were bringing up, like, oh yeah, like this is definitely a theme in scripture. But then you all developed it in a way that it doesn't compete with science, and it has all these advantages. It can explain the distribution and the scope so well, and it applies to animal suffering. And I was like, wow, this is just a really plausible story. What gives me pause is I know that you all presented this at the Philosophy of Religion workshop at Virginia Commonwealth University that you all hold each year. I think Philip, you and Andrew put that on. And I wasn't in attendance when you presented this, but at least from some people that did attend, when they told me about this, they were like, it's really thought-provoking, but it's wild. It's crazy. So I think, am I just failing to see what Am I so, Christianized, I guess, that like I've lost my sense of what's just totally out there?
Yeah.
And maybe somebody will say like you've just lost touch with what's, outrageous.
Now,
Any
stick
thoughts
with
on
your
that?
first reaction. That was the right one.
I mean, I do. I guess I'm still there. Like, it doesn't seem so outrageous to me, but maybe I hope people will do more than just give me the incredulous stare.
I think it's only wild if you think that powers and principalities and angels and created spirits are wild. I think once you're on board with like, well, if theism's not so crazy, and given theism, it's not so crazy that there would be all these created spirits in addition to terrestrial creatures, then I feel like you're 90% of the way there.
It's come to seem less and less wild to me over the last couple of years, and I guess that's maybe that could be biased as I'm like writing this paper and stuff. But I think once you think it through, you think it initially does seem kind of wild. But like, what's so wild about it? As it's not crazy that there would be these kind of beings if theism's true. It's not crazy God would give them the powers. So, yeah, at no step does it seem like you're making some kind of wild, crazy claim.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you all taking the time to discuss this with me, and congrats on this paper won you the Sanders Prize. And I don't know everything that comes with the Sanders Prize other than this, special recognition. Did you get any like grant money or something for it?
There's some money too, but
Okay. Well, congrats on that, and I hope viewers will check out the paper, and it's linked in the description below. You've just explored one of the most creative and thought-provoking answers to the problem of natural evil out there. But maybe you're still wondering, why didn't God just create these fallen creatures with better characters in the first place? Why not make them or us perfect from the start and avoid all this suffering? If that question interests you, then check out this video with Dr. Philip Swenson where he tackles that question head on.